Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. We begin with a name and a place you can point to on a map. Sarah Good, 21, a single mother from Mastic, Long Island. Late on June 6, 2014, she met friends for a night out. By the next week, her case would shift from a routine welfare check to a homicide crime scene that required clockwork procedure and zero guesswork. The pivot happens on June 12, 2014 at 6:17 p.m. Dispatch logs a 911 report of a body in the woods off Camden Court, Medford. Patrol units roll in within minutes. Their first job is not drama, it's containment. They angle cruisers to block informal footpaths, push caution tape outward, and establish a single path of entry. An officer starts the scene log. Every name and minute gets ink. EMS confirms no signs of life. The call type hardens. The detective sergeant instructs, preserve trace, map ingress/egress, keep search volunteers out of the hot zone. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They pull at the fabric of a quiet place, but the response stays clinical. To keep your bearings, one critical piece predates the body recovery. On June 8th, 4 days earlier, a gray BMW 328i linked to Sarah had been located near Fire Avenue at New London Avenue in Medford. It was flagged as suspicious and secured. That vehicle is its own scene and will be processed later. Tonight's priority is the woods. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, first responders choose documentation over motion. Wide photos, then tight frames, GPS pins of tape posts, lighting placed to avoid trampling potential transfer. No one drags, covers, or tidies. If it isn't preservation, it waits. The minute-by-minute log matters because it protects the chain of custody that will carry this case for years. 6:23 p.m., outer perimeter affirmed. 6:27 p.m., medical examiner notified. 6:31 p.m., crime scene unit en route. 6:37 p.m., first walkthrough by the lead detective and a crime scene tech. Hands visible, no touching. They note natural cover, proximity to a neighborhood cul-de-sac, and the shortest path a person could take from the curb to this thicket. Everything is photographed before it is touched, and nothing is touched before it is mapped. For context, investigators already have a dark interval in the timeline. There are no verified outgoing communications by Sarah after late June 6, early June 7 in the public record. That negative evidence will matter later, because absence of activity constrains the time of death window more tightly than speculation ever could. They also keep one eye on noise that doesn't help, tips that repeat rumors, friend of a friend claims about arguments, and log them without allowing them to steer the scene. By 6:45 p.m., the perimeter is stable. By 7 o'clock p.m., lighting lets the team capture shoe impressions around the entry path, mostly their own, now documented for exclusion. The medical examiner's investigator takes custody markers and coordinates the removal protocol. The body will become a separate scene the moment it crosses the threshold at the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's office. That is by design. The woods yield context and possible transfer. The morgue yields cause, mechanism, and trace that speaks to identity. One more guardrail is set before sunset. No one discusses the June 8 vehicle processing on this channel. Keeping scenes discreet prevents cross-contamination in court. The car will speak when it's time. Tonight, the woods speak first, and only with the facts the team can document. According to police reports, court filings, contemporaneous media, this is where the investigation earns its footing. By treating minutes like evidence and evidence like the only story that matters. The public will hear speculation. The file will record measurements. The scene in the woods is closed down. The case now moves to a controlled room where evidence isn't guessed at, it's measured. At the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's office, the remains of Sarah Good, 21, are received under chain of custody. Each transfer is documented. The patrol officer relinquishes custody to the ME investigator. Time, date, badge, and signatures are recorded. Evidence seals are inspected for breaks. Photography begins before anything is removed. This is where the file stops being a search and becomes a record. Intake is standardized. Full-body photography from multiple angles captures injuries and any debris adhering to the skin or hair. Paper bags are placed over the hands to preserve trace until fingernail scrapings and clippings are collected. Clothing, what remains of it, is dried if necessary, then individually packaged in breathable paper, not plastic, to prevent degradation. Labels note case number, item description, collector, and location on the body. Swabs are taken from orifices and any visible fluids then immediately air-dried, capped, and logged. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, a sexual assault kit is completed in full, anticipating later DNA comparison. No conjecture is put in the notes, only observations. Before autopsy, radiographs are performed. X-rays document embedded metal or fractured bone that may not be obvious externally. They reveal injury patterns and help set priorities for internal examination. Fingerprinting confirms identity for file integrity. If tissue condition impairs ridge clarity, the lab uses reconditioning techniques to raise prints. Photography continues at each new step, creating a visual chain that a jury can follow later without ambiguity. The autopsy proceeds in a fixed order. External exam. The medical examiner documents injuries by location, size, shape, and orientation. Wounds are numbered, then diagrammed. More than 40 sharp force wounds are recorded across the torso and extremities, consistent with multiple stabbing actions. A nasal fracture is documented. The pattern establishes both violence and intent. It also helps exclude self-inflicted injury. Each wound track is probed and mapped to determine depth and possible blade characteristics. If a consistent blade width or unique cutting edge appears, that note will matter when comparing to seized tools. There is no speculation about a specific weapon absent recovery. The report sticks to measurable features. Internal exam, organ-by-organ evaluation documents, blood loss, wound trajectories, and any defensive injuries. The ME evaluates the presence or absence of hemorrhage around certain wounds to sequence events, what occurred ante-mortem versus peri or post-mortem. Stomach contents are retained as time markers. Blood and vitreous humor are drawn for toxicology, alcohol, common controlled substances, not to shift blame, but to complete the clinical picture. Toxicology also provides baseline comparisons against witness accounts of the night out. Trace collection is systematic. Hair shafts and roots are pulled from multiple scalp regions. Foreign hairs are preserved separately if found. Contact DNA swabs target areas likely to retain touch DNA, neck, wrists, inner arms, collected with dry sterile swabs to prevent dilution. Bruising and abrasion patterns on the arms and hands are photographed with scale rulers to document potential restraint or defensive motions. All packaging follows contamination prevention standards. New gloves per item, clean tools per sample, fresh butcher paper or sterile pads under each piece of evidence. Every bag is labeled and initialed. Every seal is signed. Findings are recorded as preliminary during the procedure, then issued as final after review. The cause of death is certified as sharp force injuries. The clinical description of sexual assault is supported by swab results and injury patterning. The sexual assault kit proceeds to the crime lab for DNA processing. In cases like this, the lab will prioritize semen fraction isolation, quantification, amplification, e.g., STR profiling, and entry into CODIS if no known standard is available. Because this case already has a vehicle scene tied to Sarah, the lab will also prepare to cross-reference any DNA obtained here with trace from that car, without presuming a match. The autopsy does not chase a narrative, it produces a dataset. Time of death estimation is treated cautiously. Environmental conditions in wooded terrain can distort surface indicators. The ME correlates liver temperature, lividity fixation, rigor distribution, insect activity, if present, and last known alive reports. The result is not a magic timestamp. It's a window consistent with the late June 6, early June 7 final contacts cited in public reporting. That window will be crucial when investigators later test alibis against carrier records and any relevant camera captures. As one senior detective put it in a briefing, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. A narrow clock forces the team to eliminate noise, not bend facts to fit a theory. Chain of custody dominates the last portion of the procedure. Each collected item, swab, clipping, hair, clothing fragment, is logged, sealed, and transferred to the Suffolk County Crime Lab or retained at the ME with documented storage conditions. Duplicate seals are avoided, broken seals are never reused. If an item must be re-examined, a new seal with a new signature is applied, and both are captured in the audit trail. According to court filings and contemporaneous media, these details later insulate the core evidence from suppression challenges. There is a humane dimension that belongs in any responsible telling. Sarah Good is not a statistic. She is a daughter and a mother. The clinical steps do not diminish that. They protect it. Proper documentation gives the family answers that rumor cannot, and it gives the justice system material that stands up when contested. In towns like Medford, people remember faces and first names. The file remembers times, distances, and measurements. Both matter. The output of this chapter is not a reveal. It's a foundation. The woods were context. The morgue is confirmation. The next scene, the BMW 328i secured days earlier, will be treated with the same discipline. If the autopsy shows how, the car may help show where and by whom, but we won't jump ahead. Procedure dictates sequence. The woods are secured. Attention shifts to the car that surfaced days earlier and has been stored for controlled processing. A gray BMW 328i linked to Sarah Good. Tow paperwork, impound logs, and photographs confirm the pickup point at Fire Avenue near New London Avenue in Medford. Before a single surface is touched, the team documents the exterior on a turntable pad. 4 sides, high and mid-angles, hood, and roof planes. Lighting adjusted to make ridge detail and smear direction visible. Tape rulers and arrows mark every observable transfer so nothing relies on memory when this footage is replayed in court. Access is limited to a small roster: a crime scene photographer, a latent print specialist, a trace examiner, and the lead detective. Everyone swaps gloves between tasks and uses fresh paper under any removed item. The goal is straightforward: preserve, detect, collect, and account for transfer that can be linked back to a person or event window relevant to June 6-8. Exterior first. Under oblique light, reddish transfers stand out on the hood. A latent print specialist dusts test patches, then abandons powder in favor of photography and gel lifters to capture ridge and crease detail that powder could mask. The technician isolates clear palm features, creases, thinner patterns, ridge path, and lifts them on clean carriers with date, time, and initials recorded at the edge. These impressions are marked as working until an identification is made at the lab. Nothing is called a match on the floor. Door frames and handles show additional contact points. Each contact zone is swabbed for possible touch DNA with dry, sterile swabs and immediate air drying. The doors are photographed ajar to preserve hinge position and to reveal edge transfers that often get smudged. A second set of gel lifters captures partial ridge detail consistent with a right hand in a bracing position. Again, working only, tagged for comparison later. Interior next. The driver's seat rails are measured to record fore aft position. Floor mats are lifted to reveal loose fibers and particulate. Each cavity is vacuumed through filtered traps so the lab can examine debris without sifting the entire interior. The console, gear selector, and steering rim are swabbed for DNA in a pattern that lets the lab separate mixtures by location. The glove box contents are photographed in place and then bagged as a unit. Nothing suggests a theft motive. No punched locks, no stripped column, no forced ignition. That observation is limited to what is visible and recorded. It's not an opinion, it's a condition. Note: the trace examiner inspects fabric for transfers that can travel: hair, grass seed, insect fragments, tiny burrs that often link vehicles to ground. Any foreign hair is placed in bindles, labeled as preliminary trace until the lab can identify species and, if human, whether root material is sufficient for nuclear DNA. Throughout the process, footwear of the team is logged so later comparisons can exclude their tread inside the car. A measuring wheel and scene photos from the pickup point establish how the BMW sat in relation to curb and brush. The angle is slightly off-axis from a typical parallel park, a fact the detective flags because unintended angles sometimes reflect haste. That is not a conclusion. It's an investigative note that becomes valuable only when aligned with the rest of the record. With exterior collections complete, luminol is considered and set aside. The visible transfers are already documented and sampled, and luminol can dilute residual DNA. The team opts for targeted phenolphthalein tests on select swabs instead, deferring broad chemiluminescent screening unless the lab requests it later. A handheld ALS checks for non-blood biological fluorescence on seat fabric and interior door panels. Positive areas are swabbed and logged. Once the car is photographed to the standard that allows a jury to understand sequence without an expert in the room, the latent lift carriers and swabs move to the property room under seal. The custody form reflects each item: who collected, who sealed, and where it goes next. The latent print specialist notes ridge details sufficient for comparison on specific palm lifts. Those carriers are now marked ready for identification at the latent lab. Later testimony will call them confirmed, but that language is reserved for court. And because the impound point sits near residential streets, detectives canvass for cameras. They isolate homes and small businesses with visible doorbell units or DVR domes facing Fire Avenue and approach each owner with standard consent requests. If owners agree, timestamps are checked against a reference clock to account for drift. Even short clips, headlights gliding, a silhouette passing, brake lights brightening, can anchor the movement of a car before or after it was left. If no useful footage is recovered, that absence is logged as negative digital evidence, a boundary as useful as a positive hit when mapping routes. The vehicle scene ends with a walkthrough against the autopsy's confirmed injuries. Technicians compare where hands would naturally brace on a hood if pressure were applied and whether transfer locations line up with what was recorded on the body. This is not to guess at narrative. It is to ensure the sampling strategy covers the most probative zones before natural degradation advances. The lead detective puts it plainly: evidence must be repeatable, not dramatic. What matters to viewers and to a jury is that each piece can be followed from roadside to courtroom without gaps. The BMW gives that chance. With palm impressions lifted and interior swabs sealed, the next steps belong to laboratories that turn working into confirmed through method and documentation. This car isn't a theory, it's a set of measurements. When those measurements align with timelines and records, they stop being interesting and start being proof. With the car sealed and logged, the next layer is the network: who contacted whom, when, and from which corridors of Long Island. Investigators serve preservation letters to carriers within hours of the homicide classification, then follow with subpoenas for call detail records and cell site usage for the victim and key associates tied to the June 6-8, 2014 window. The ask is not exotic. Dates, times, dialed numbers, call duration, SMS, MMS metadata where available, and the serving tower with sector orientation. Because this is pre-2025 and consistent with 2014 practice, there is no GPS or Find My data in play. What the records do provide is a lattice of times and sectors that can be tested against everything already known about the crime. The first anchor is a dark interval that begins after Sarah's known late evening contacts June 6th into June 7th. On the victim handset, investigators note a lack of verified outgoing activity beyond that period in the public record. That negative evidence doesn't prove where she is. It limits when she could have moved, who could have seen her, and which towers could have served a handset still powered on versus one silenced. The lab scrubs for any after-hours voicemail checks, missed call logs, or silent data sessions that might show a background ping. If none are documented by the carrier, the absence is logged plainly rather than interpreted. Focus then shifts to associates who were with Sarah or interacted close to that time frame. Carriers provide their CDRs under the same order set, and analysts build call graphs that avoid guesswork. They look for overlaps, the same 2 or 3 numbers circling each other late June 6th, brief bursts in the early morning, then radio silence. Those graphs are matched to cell site maps. On Long Island, a few miles can mean a different sector orientation entirely. A 3-sector tower facing Fire Avenue versus a residential sector near Camden Court implies different paths. When the graph shows contacts and the sites show possible travel legs, the team requests supplemental records to see if later that night aligns with a device crossing through Medford corridors. Parallel to phone logs, detectives continue the camera canvas started in the vehicle chapter. Residential doorbells and small business DVRs don't always keep accurate time. Drift can be minutes or more. Each cooperating owner's device is time-corrected with a reference clock. Clips are captured and hashed. Even if a camera can't resolve a plate, a sequence of headlights turning, then brake lights flaring near the pickup point can bracket a vehicle drop time. If there is no usable video, that is documented as negative digital evidence rather than ignored. Found or not, it shapes the boundary of what can be claimed. A useful check in this era is billing cadence. Carriers often log periodic network events, registration updates, voicemail polling, independent of user action. Analysts examine whether the victim's handset shows any network registration pings after June 7th. If there are none in the carrier return, it supports the already noted dark interval. If there are sporadic pings, investigators compare those times to tower locations to see if the handset could have been moved separately from the person. That possibility is kept open but not assumed. The report states only what is recorded. Investigators also test the overlap between devices and places already locked in earlier chapters. If a contact's phone hits a tower that routinely serves Fire Avenue around the window the BMW appears, that's marked for follow-up. If another contact's handset shows no activity within minutes of relevant site hits, that absence is just as important. People often believe silence is nothing, but in analysis, it's a constraint that narrows who could be present. When two handsets show parallel movement, same towers, similar times, detectives check whether the users know each other and whether that pairing lines up with interviews collected later. Any social or messaging metadata lawfully obtained is treated as additive, not primary, in 2014 workflows. A time-stamped scene marker on a message is less reliable than a carrier log, so it is used to cue further lawful process, not to anchor the timeline. If the data surfaces references to a meetup or a ride, those lines go on the task sheet for Chapter 5's interview schedule. Where digital evidence can drift, cell site mapping pulls it back to physical roads. Analysts render sectors for towers that serve the Fire Avenue/New London Avenue area and the Camden Court vicinity. They shade likely roadway arcs between those sectors given antenna azimuth and known obstructions. The output is not a route. It's a corridor where a handset could reasonably be if it used that sector at that minute. Investigators then compare this to NYS traffic cams and any municipal feeds, understanding that many do not retain footage beyond short cycles. The objective remains the same: pair a documented phone event with a real-world corridor without claiming precision the technology doesn't provide. One quiet but important step is clock alignment across all sources. Patrol body cam timestamps, if any exist, the ME call-out time, tow yard logs, private DVRs, and carrier records are adjusted to a single reference. This avoids the illusion of contradiction that sometimes comes from clocks set 5 minutes apart. The clean clock lets the team say, on the record, which events are simultaneous and which simply appear to be after time drift. As the matrix fills, a small cluster of numbers rises in relevance: people connected socially to the night out, devices that repeatedly appear on sectors feeding into Medford, and one or two patterns that persist even after June 7. The analyst note is cautious, working candidates for deeper scrutiny, not suspects by label. Their value is in how their traffic aligns with the BMW location and the body is seen timing. Names are withheld here to keep the narrative focused on method, not early conclusion. This chapter's value to a jury or a viewer is clarity. In 2014, the network can narrow a story without pretending to finish it. When overlaid with the autopsy window and the vehicle evidence, the call records and cell site usage move the file from open questions to testable claims. No dramatics, just a clock, a map, and records that don't change when retold. The next step is to sit down with the people behind the phone numbers and measure words against logs. With call graphs and cell site sectors mapped, the next step is simple. Put people in chairs and line their words against the record. Detectives start with those who saw Sarah Good on the night of June 6, 2014. Each interview is audio recorded, time-stamped, and summarized on a standard form: who the person is, how they know Sarah, when and where they last saw her, and what contact, if any, occurred after midnight. The first objective is exclusion. Several men in Sarah's circle provide consent swabs and fingerprints. When lab comparisons later exclude them against the sexual assault kit and the latent lifts from the BMW, those results are logged as negative evidence that tightens the field without sensationalizing anyone's name. Statements are tested against the digital matrix built in Chapter 4. If a friend reports leaving a bar around a certain time, analysts check the handset's call detail records for any hits and the nearest cell site sector. If a person claims they were home all night, investigators look for carrier events consistent with that location or confirm a lack of activity that fits the silence window. The purpose is not to trap a witness, it is to reconcile memory with artifacts. Where memory drifts, the artifacts hold. Two interviews become focal because of overlap. Both individuals place themselves in Medford corridors relevant to the Fire Avenues and New London Avenue area and acknowledge seeing Sarah earlier in the evening. Their accounts differ in small ways: who left first, whether there was a stop for food, how long a conversation lasted. On paper, those differences are trivial. Against the clock, they matter. The call records show brief bursts of activity followed by a quiet span later that night that matches the victim's dark interval. That alignment is not proof, but it is the kind of alignment that earns follow-up. Detectives use a structured approach to inconsistencies. Isolate, test, resolve. Isolate means quoting the exact line, "I went straight home," and pinning it to a minute range. Test means pulling any available logs, carriers, cameras already collected, even credit card authorizations, to see if external data corroborate or contradict the claim. Resolve means giving the witness a second pass with the data in view and documenting any correction. A corrected timeline is not automatically deceptive. It is common when late nights blur. What matters is whether the corrected line now fits other proven facts, like the BMW appearing near Fire Avenue or a handset touching a sector that usually serves Camden Court. One person, already flagged by proximity to the vehicle corridor, offers a detail that investigators can actually test. An assertion about the time they left a friend's home. That address has a doorbell camera. With consent, detectives sync the clip time to a reference clock and capture a window that shows this person approaching and leaving. The departure moment does not match the interview claim. It is off by enough minutes to matter. The discrepancy is placed in the statement analysis with a neutral label. Working inconsistency. It is not a lie. It is a variance awaiting context. Meanwhile, the exclusions keep stacking. A former partner submits prints and a DNA standard and is ruled out by both. Another acquaintance's handset never touches the sectors that serve Fire Avenue during the relevant hours. Their statement aligns with phone inactivity and a time-coded social post from a different town. Those confirmed exclusions are as important as a lead because they eliminate side corridors that pull attention and public rumor away from the narrow band where Sarah's movements can actually be traced. Investigators also document behavior after the date range because post-event conduct can suggest flight avoidance or nothing at all. Travel out of state near mid-July is evaluated alongside phone registrations and custody paperwork to see whether the timing appears reactive. Here, the narration stays disciplined. The notes mark dates and movements. Motive is left for court argument, not an interview room. By the end of this phase, a small subset of interviews sits in a different file tier. Not suspects by label, but priority re-interviews. People whose words require reconciliation with carrier data, cell site sectors, and the car corridor. Each will be scheduled with counsel notices as needed, and each will be approached with the same rule set. No guessing, no fishing, just the clean clock and the documented path to and from Medford. The file is about to shift from comparison to commitment. When interviews, lab exclusions, palm impressions from the BMW, and the autopsy's scientific findings are read together, they form a charging narrative that can be tested, challenged, and, if it holds, taken to a jury. Next, we move to how those pieces are assembled into formal charges. With interviews reconciled to the record, the investigation shifted into building a charging theory, an evidentiary framework strong enough to support indictment and withstand motions. Prosecutors emphasized two anchors. The first was the palm print, lifted from the hood of Sarah Good's BMW, recorded in lab documentation as a latent impression in what appeared to be blood. Examiners matched it to a known subject after multiple levels of verification, ruling out all others who had been swabbed and printed. The second anchor was the DNA profile recovered through the sexual assault kit. When compared against a court-ordered buccal swab, the lab confirmed the identity match. Both findings, physical and biological, were independently tested and peer-reviewed, giving prosecutors confidence in their admissibility. Those inclusions were paired with exclusions. Every other male close to Sarah, her ex-boyfriend, friends present that night, had voluntarily provided samples and were cleared. The negative evidence reinforced the theory: no forced entry to her car, no unexplained transfer of fingerprints, and no activity on Sarah's phone during the critical hours. It was the kind of alignment prosecutors look for: consistent, narrow, and difficult to explain away. Interagency coordination played a central role. Suffolk County homicide detectives worked with the district attorney's office to draft a warrant affidavit. Preservation letters and subpoenas secured digital logs, while orders were obtained for buccal swabs, palm impressions, and device imaging. When the suspect surfaced in Florida on an unrelated warrant, law enforcement coordinated interstate. Within days, he was extradited back to Long Island, arraigned in Suffolk County Court, and ordered held without bail. This stage represented a turning point. The case was no longer about searching for a missing young mother. It was about presenting a narrative of opportunity, contact, and violence, supported by the physical traces she left behind. Sarah Good's name appeared at the top of every charging document, and with it the state's duty to pursue justice. The charging theory established the next focus would be on admissibility battles, motions, suppression attempts, and the careful sorting of what the jury would ultimately be allowed to hear. As the charging documents were filed, the case entered the pretrial phase, where evidence was tested not in the lab but in the courtroom. This stage determines what the jury will ultimately hear, and it often decides the strength of a homicide prosecution before opening statements are ever delivered. The defense strategy became clear early. Counsel for Dante Taylor moved to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing that the buccal swab had been obtained under coercive conditions. They claimed the subject had not been adequately advised of his rights before providing the sample. Prosecutors countered with affidavits showing that Taylor had been served with a valid court order, and that collection was performed under medical supervision with chain of custody preserved. Court records indicate the judge denied the motion, citing established precedent on compelled swabs in violent crime cases. A second motion targeted the palm print. The defense attempted to discredit the reliability of the latent impression lifted from Sarah's vehicle, citing the possibility of contamination during collection. The state's fingerprint examiners testified in a preliminary hearing that the sample was lifted under controlled conditions, documented with photographs, and matched through multiple independent verifications. Again, the court ruled the evidence admissible, finding the defense's claims speculative. Digital records were also challenged. Logs showing gaps in Sarah's phone activity during the hours she was believed to have been attacked were introduced as corroborating evidence of her incapacitation. Defense argued that the absence of phone use could not directly prove assault, but prosecutors stressed that combined with other physical evidence, the silent phone period was a critical, negative indicator. The court allowed the records, with instructions that jurors would weigh their significance. Prosecutors anticipated that defense would attempt to portray Sarah's social life as chaotic, suggesting voluntary encounters rather than coercion. To block irrelevant character attacks, pretrial motions in limine were filed to exclude any testimony about unrelated relationships. The judge agreed, restricting the defense from introducing speculative evidence about Sarah's lifestyle that did not directly bear on the crime. This ruling protected the dignity of the victim and ensured the trial would focus on forensic facts. Bail hearings had already confirmed Taylor would remain held without bond. The severity of the charges, the violent nature of the crime, and his prior record all weighed heavily against release. Risk of flight was also documented, given his earlier presence in another state when detectives first moved to arrest him. Pre-trial thus served as a sorting mechanism. What the jury would hear was narrowed to the fingerprint, the DNA, the digital records, and corroborating testimony from investigators. Every piece had survived legal challenge, reinforcing the state's theory of the crime and closing off avenues for the defense to exclude key findings. This process also highlighted the human dimension. For Sarah's family, attending hearings where her last hours were discussed clinically was another form of trauma. Yet each ruling in favor of admissibility signaled that her voice, through science and procedure, would not be silenced in court. The legal battle settled, the case moved toward jury selection and the trial itself, where these decisions would play out in front of 12 citizens tasked with delivering justice. With the key rulings in place, the file moved from motions to open court. Jury selection focused on two issues. Could jurors weigh forensic science without bias, and could they evaluate sensitive facts without punishing the victim? Once sworn, they heard a tight sequence built around what was already cleared for trial. Prosecutors opened with a simple frame. A young mother, Sarah Good, last seen alive after a night out. Her BMW later located near Medford with a latent palm impression and apparent blood on the hood. Her remains recovered days later, and lab work confirming sexual assault plus a DNA identity match to the defendant, Dante Taylor. The message was procedural, not emotional. Opportunity, contact, transfer, and corroboration. The state's first witness was the latent print examiner. Without embellishment, the examiner described photographing, dusting, and lifting the palm impression from the hood, documenting the process with scale images and worksheet notations. The comparison steps, feature selection, correspondence, and independent verification were laid out in plain language. Cross-examination pushed contamination and handling. The witness answered with chain of custody entries, sealed packaging, and a second practitioner review that reached the same identification. The jurors wrote notes. They were given the clean version, uncolored by speculation. The medical examiner followed. Cause of death, sharp force injuries. The exam charted multiple stab wounds and a nasal fracture, described clinically to avoid unnecessary detail. The doctor explained injury distribution, hemorrhage patterns consistent with perimortem trauma, and sexual assault kit collection procedures. The testimony linked time markers to what investigators already knew about the silent window on Sarah's phone activity later that night, careful to state the medical limits. Pathology alone cannot stamp an exact minute, but it can anchor the window. Defense asked about alternative scenarios. The doctor returned to what could be supported and what could not. It kept the room sober. A state DNA analyst took the stand next. The analyst explained extraction, quantification, amplification, and short tandem repeat analysis from the sexual assault kit. Allele calls were read against the known sample collected by court order. The conclusion, an identity match to the defendant, was presented with the laboratory's validation controls and proficiency testing history. Defense challenged lab error rates and mixtures in general. The analyst stayed with this sample, these controls, and these results. In homicide trials, clarity often beats flourish. Here, clarity held. Digital records were introduced to provide context rather than dominance. Carriers authenticated call detail logs and cell site sectors illustrating where handsets likely were or were not during the relevant hours. The point was restrained. Sarah's phone went quiet. Certain other phones intersected sectors that served the Medford corridors. Those movements lined up with the vehicle's recovery point and the woodland area later cordoned by police. The state avoided overpromising precision that technology could not deliver in 2014. The jurors were told exactly what the data could do and, importantly, what it could not. Detectives testified on interviews and eliminations. Names had been collected, prints and DNA standards taken with consent or court order, and comparisons run. Several men were excluded by laboratory reports and by the absence of their devices in the corridor at the critical hours. One witness's timeline variance, small on paper, was shown alongside doorbell footage time-checked to a reference clock. The inconsistency did not stand alone. It sat next to the palm impression and the DNA result that the defense had failed to suppress. The theme remained constant. When memory drifted, artifacts held. The defense presented an alternative narrative bounded by two arguments, that the sexual encounter was voluntary and that the trace evidence could have arrived innocently. Counsel stressed the lack of eyewitnesses to the murder and the general proposition that DNA can show contact, not necessarily force, but on cross the state re-anchored each point, the medical examiner's injury map, the staircase of events around the phone's dark interval, and the physical reality of a bloody palm impression deposited on the victim's car. One by one, conjectures met the record. Closing arguments kept to admissible pillars. The prosecution walked the jury through a single chain. Sarah's last known live sightings, the BMW with a bloody palm, the body as seen examination, the DNA match, the corroborating digital and interview constraints, the consistent exclusions. The defense urged reasonable doubt based on absence. No camera captured the attack. No single data point gave the exact minute. The state answered with accumulation. In serious crime, proof often has to be built layer by layer, each tested, each surviving. Deliberations did not stretch for days. When the jury returned, they delivered guilty verdicts on murder in the first degree and rape in the first degree. At sentencing, the judge reviewed aggravating factors: the brutality of the attack, the sexual violence, and the community harm. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In a brief statement, Sarah's family spoke about a daughter, a sister, and a mother who should have been safe in her own community. The courtroom remained quiet. The decision had been made within the bounds of law and evidence. After the verdict, the file did not close. It transitioned. Post-conviction confinement was recorded by the Department of Corrections. The following year, officials reported that Dante Taylor died by suicide while in state custody. The court record did not change. Conviction stood. Sentence stood. What changed was the possibility of future parole hearings or appellate relief through his testimony. For Sarah's family, there would be no apologies or explanations from the person a jury had found responsible. That reality is often the last administrative entry in a homicide file, and never the last human one. Cases like this remind us what procedure is for. Precision protects the innocent and narrows the field when rumor runs ahead of fact. It honors the victim by making sure her life is not reduced to a headline but documented through the science that spoke for her when she could not. Communities on Long Island know this. When a homicide happens in familiar places, it tears at shared trust. The response has to rebuild that trust, line by line, with accountable work. One more note, because you've stayed with us this far. True crime storytelling carries a responsibility. If you know something, say something early. Silence can be the longest wound a family carries. That is not drama. It is a public safety lesson written into every phone log, camera pull, and lab sheet in this file. Guilty, sentenced to life without parole. As I close this story, I can't help but think about how fragile life is and how important it is to pay attention to warning signs. Sarah's tragedy shows us the weight of silence, the danger of obsession, and the power of forensic truth in bringing justice. For me, the lesson is clear. Justice isn't just about courts, it's about communities looking out for each other before crime takes a life. What do you think? How can we, as neighbors and friends, prevent the next tragedy? If this video spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.